We've built particle accelerators that can recreate the Big Bang, but we still can't explain where entire libraries of ancient knowledge disappeared, or why some of the smartest empires on Earth seemed desperate to bury their own science. Today, we're diving into 10 of the most mysterious knowledge thefts in human history stories that blend history, science, and conspiracy in ways that make you question who really controls human progress. From the Vatican's secret raids to modern pharmaceutical cover-ups, these aren't random legends. Many are backed by archaeological finds, declassified intelligence documents, and academic gaps that shouldn't exist unless someone deliberately erased them. And here's the kicker. Every single one of these cases hints that humanity once held knowledge far beyond what we thought possible: astronomy, medicine, even consciousness itself, only to have it locked away for centuries. But before we jump to conclusions, let's trace the evidence piece by piece, starting with one of the most infamous intellectual heists in human history, the one the Church never wanted you to know about. Because what if the Dark Ages weren't caused by ignorance, but by a cover-up? Let's begin with the Vatican Heist and the raid that may have rewritten the history of science itself. The Vatican Heist. You'd think that history's greatest loss of knowledge happened by accident. Burned libraries, lost scrolls, forgotten texts. But what if some of it wasn't lost? It was stolen. In the year 1204, during the chaos of the Fourth Crusade, the city of Constantinople was torn apart. The official record says Crusaders went rogue, looting and destroying one of the richest cities in the ancient world. But recently unearthed Vatican documents paint a more deliberate picture, a targeted operation, not a chaotic raid. Behind the scenes, Cardinal Giovanni de Montecorvino allegedly led a team of Vatican agents on a covert mission. Their target: the Imperial Library, a treasure trove of over 120,000 manuscripts, some dating back to ancient Greece and Egypt. These weren't just dusty scrolls of philosophy and poetry. They contained scientific theories, historical accounts, and religious writings that directly challenged church doctrine. Among the manuscripts, one stood out: the complete works of Aristarchus of Samos. Aristarchus proposed that Earth orbited the Sun nearly 1700 years before Copernicus. His mathematical precision, reportedly far ahead of its time, could have rewritten cosmology centuries earlier. But instead it vanished into Vatican vaults, never to resurface. And that's not all. Some confiscated texts allegedly described atomic theory, surgical methods, and even records of Jesus' life written by Roman historians depicting him not as divine, but as a radical philosopher and reformer. Imagine how differently Western civilization might have evolved if those ideas had spread freely. Now, before you think this sounds like pure conspiracy, here's where it gets interesting. In 2012, researchers studying early Renaissance manuscripts found marginal notes referencing Greek heliocentric calculations known only to the Church. It's as if fragments of those hidden works quietly influenced scholars centuries later without ever being publicly acknowledged. Modern historians like Dr. Silvia Serafini from the University of Bologna point out that the Vatican's restricted archives still contain tens of thousands of unclassified documents from the Crusader era, sealed for reasons of theological sensitivity. It's not proof of a global cover-up, but it's enough to make you wonder what knowledge is still sitting in those underground vaults. And if you think that's unsettling, wait until you hear what really happened to the Library of Alexandria, the one that supposedly burned. Because what if history's most famous library fire was actually history's most successful heist, the Alexandria Extraction? We've all heard the tragic story. The Library of Alexandria, humanity's greatest collection of knowledge, burned to ashes, a symbol of our lost brilliance. But what if that fire was just a cover story? According to archaeological findings from the 1990s and fragments of Roman transport records, Alexandria's knowledge didn't burn, it was evacuated. Scholars now suspect that the so-called destruction was a systematic extraction, one of the largest intellectual thefts in history. It began around 391 CE under Emperor Theodosius I, who ordered the destruction of pagan temples. But before the torching began, Roman agents quietly catalogued and removed specific manuscripts, those containing engineering blueprints, mathematical treatises, and astronomical calculations far ahead of their time. Among them was the full engineering portfolio of Hero of Alexandria, who built functioning steam engines and automatic doors centuries before industrial technology existed. His mechanical genius could have triggered an early technological revolution if only his designs hadn't vanished into imperial archives. And here's the twist: modern engineers have verified that Hero's concepts like pressure-based motion and automated mechanics were theoretically sound. NASA even referenced his early pneumatics when studying the origins of fluid dynamics. That's right, a Greek inventor from the 1st century was tinkering with physics we'd only formalized nearly 800 years later. But Hero's manuscripts weren't the only treasures seized. Roman intelligence reportedly targeted records of pre-flood civilizations, documents that described cyclical global catastrophes, precise planetary alignments and technologies that shouldn't have existed for that era. Whether myth or misunderstood science, it's clear the Romans believed these texts were dangerous. So why hide them? Historians suggest the Roman elite feared the destabilizing power of free knowledge. If the public knew ancient peoples had achieved such sophistication, it would challenge the empire's divine authority and its monopoly on progress. Excavations in Alexandria's harbour found storage rooms showing signs of careful removal, not fire. No soot, no collapse, just empty shelves and scraped walls. And Roman shipping logs preserved in archives from Antioch describe exceptional cargo of papyri transferred to secure facilities in Italy during the same period. So the Great Fire of Alexandria might have been one of history's most successful PR campaigns, turning a theft into a tragedy. And while Rome hid its spoils, the ripple effects of that loss still shape science today. Imagine where we'd be if 2,000 years of progress hadn't been erased overnight. And if you thought ancient engineers were ahead of their time, wait until you hear what the Maya were calculating half a world away. Their astronomical precision made European scientists look like amateurs. The Mayan manuscript seizure. Picture this, the year is 1524, and Spanish conquistadors are marching through the jungles of the Yucatan. They're expecting gold temples and treasure. Instead, they find libraries filled with folded bark paper books called codices, covered in intricate glyphs and star charts. And what those books contained was more valuable than any jewel. The Mayans weren't just building pyramids, they were mapping the cosmos. Their astronomers had charted the movements of Venus and Jupiter with accuracy so sharp that modern NASA software confirmed their eclipse predictions were off by mere minutes. It's the kind of precision that shouldn't have been possible without telescopes. Yet they did it using naked eyes, obsidian mirrors, and centuries of careful observation. But instead of marveling at this brilliance, the conquistadors panicked. Knowledge this advanced didn't fit the European narrative of primitive savages. So the church declared the codices demonic and ordered them destroyed. Or at least, that's what the official story says. Declassified letters from Spanish court astronomer Pedro de Medina tell a different tale. They describe astronomical manuscripts of unusual genius secretly transferred to Madrid's Royal Observatory. Medina himself later published remarkably advanced navigation charts, one suspiciously similar to Mayan planetary data. Among the missing texts was the legendary Jaguar Prophecy Codex, said to predict solar eclipses, the arrival of strange diseases from the east, and even the collapse of empires. Modern archaeologists call it myth. But linguistic analysis of surviving fragments shows a timeline that eerily aligns with major historical events, including the fall of the Aztecs and the spread of European plagues. Even more astonishing were the medical codices, plant-based treatments for infections, fevers, and wounds that European doctors couldn't yet cure. Some of those remedies, rediscovered centuries later, became the basis for modern antibiotics and anti-inflammatory drugs. Coincidence maybe, but patterns like these are hard to ignore. By the late 16th century, the official record claimed nearly all Mayan codices were burned. Yet scattered references to foreign star tables appear in Spanish naval documents well into the 1600s. It's as if their knowledge was absorbed, stripped of its origin, relabeled, and quietly repurposed to expand empire. Even today, access to some Mayan archives in Madrid remains restricted for conservation reasons. Maybe that's true. Or maybe those codices still hold astronomical data too precise to explain away. And if you thought stealing star maps was bold, the next raid wasn't just about outer space. It was about inner space, the human mind itself. Let's travel to Tibet 1959, where ancient monks guarded something science is only now beginning to rediscover the power of consciousness. The Tibetan Knowledge Raid. In 1959, as Chinese troops stormed into Tibet, the world saw it as a political takeover. But beneath the military headlines, another operation was unfolding, one aimed not at land, but at mind. Tibetan monasteries had guarded thousands of handwritten scrolls for centuries. Texts describing advanced meditation practices, consciousness control, and healing techniques that made Western medicine look primitive. These weren't mystical fairy tales. They contained precise physiological instructions, how to slow the heartbeat at will, regulate body temperature in freezing conditions, and even sustain awareness during clinical death. When Chinese intelligence realized what these monks could do, they sent not just soldiers but scientists and translators. According to accounts from refugees and declassified files from the 1980s, select monasteries were raided with surgical precision. Monks were interrogated or recruited to identify the most valuable manuscripts before they disappeared into state laboratories. One particularly coveted text was called the Consciousness Transfer Manual. It described a form of out-of-body projection, not in the mystical sense, but as a structured process involving breath rhythm and neurological conditioning. Sound far-fetched? Maybe not. Modern neuroscience has confirmed similar phenomena in lab experiments where sensory deprivation and brain stimulation can induce the illusion of consciousness separating from the body. By the 1970s, reports emerged that China's defense institutes were experimenting with remote viewing attempts to perceive distant objects or events through focused awareness. The CIA's Stargate project, launched around the same time, investigated similar psychic claims, and some declassified files referenced data on Tibetan protocols. Coincidence or quiet collaboration? Meanwhile, the medical side of these texts was equally revolutionary. Tibetan healers treated trauma and infection through methods that today might fall under psychoneuroimmunology, the science of how thought affects immunity. Harvard researchers later documented monks drying wet sheets with body heat in sub-zero rooms during meditation, proof that mind-body control wasn't just myth. But back in 1959, those discoveries were considered too powerful to share. The surviving monks who escaped to India reported that the libraries were emptied before the flames arrived. Officially, China claimed those documents were lost in the war, yet multiple intelligence leaks suggest they still exist, fueling classified consciousness research. So next time you hear about mind over matter, remember entire nations once fought to own that phrase literally. And while those secrets explored the limits of human consciousness, the next great theft targeted something far more tangible than natural world itself. Because between 1870 and 1920, the US government began quietly stealing Native American scientific knowledge from weather prediction to pharmaceuticals and selling it to the highest bidder. The Native American text theft. Between 1870 and 1920, while America was building railroads and rewriting its national identity, another story unfolded quietly in the shadows, one that had nothing to do with manifest destiny and everything to do with stolen knowledge. Federal agents and Christian missionaries began visiting Native American tribes under the guise of preserving culture. They claimed to be safeguarding tribal wisdom for future study. But according to recently declassified Bureau of Indian Affairs documents, that preservation was really a systematic extraction. They weren't just collecting myths or stories, they were targeting scientific data, advanced agricultural methods, geological maps, and centuries-old medicinal formulas. Some of the confiscated materials were astonishingly sophisticated. Handwritten scrolls and oral histories described crop rotation systems that naturally rejuvenated soil without artificial fertilizers. Modern agronomists later rediscovered similar principles and named them sustainable farming. The irony, native tribes had already perfected it centuries before. Then there were the pharmaceutical records, detailed accounts of medicinal plants used to treat fevers, infections, and even chronic illnesses. In one particularly disturbing case, researchers found internal memos linking these confiscations to early patents by major pharmaceutical companies. A century later, the very same compounds were being sold in pharmacies, stripped of their cultural origins and branded as Western innovation. And that's just the surface. Some of the seized texts mapped weather patterns and mineral deposits across North America, knowledge gathered through generations of observation. The National Weather Service quietly incorporated many of these forecasting techniques, removing any mention of their indigenous roots. It's no coincidence that government geological surveys expanded right after these confiscations. The tribal maps were more than just cartography, they were roadmaps to resources oil, gold, and copper. Spiritual texts were also taken, ones that described methods of altered consciousness, sensory awareness, and healing through ceremony. Modern psychologists now study these same principles under new names: mindfulness, somatic therapy, trauma release. It's humbling to realize how much of what we call modern science may have been born from knowledge taken without credit. When tribal elders asked for their manuscripts back, they were told the materials were too fragile to return. Others were said to be lost in university archives. But the commercial use of their knowledge never stopped. It simply changed branding. So next time you see an all-natural medicine or a climate-adaptive farming method, there's a chance it traces back to wisdom once confiscated, censored, and quietly monetized. And as shocking as that is, it was far from the last time science and greed collided. Because just a few decades later in the golden age of archaeology, corporate-funded expeditions to Egypt would pull off one of the most expensive and deliberate knowledge heists in medical history. The Egyptian medical conspiracy. The 1920s were an age of exploration tombs, where opening mummies were unwrapped and newspapers screamed headlines about ancient secrets revealed. But behind the romance of archaeology was something far less noble: corporate espionage disguised as discovery. Several expeditions to Egypt during this time weren't funded by universities or museums. They were bankrolled by pharmaceutical conglomerates from Europe and the US. Their real goal: to find and quietly remove ancient medical texts that could threaten modern drug markets. Among the most valuable finds were fragments of the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus and the Ebers papyrus, real artifacts that exist today but not in full form. The surviving portions describe procedures for brain surgery, tumor removal, and wound treatment, with antiseptic solutions that predate modern medicine by 3,000 years. But researchers at the time noticed something strange. The most detailed pages, the ones referencing formulas and natural compounds, were missing from museum archives. According to letters uncovered decades later, private contractors working with these expeditions were instructed to extract only pharmaceutically relevant materials. Those materials were then shipped not to Cairo's museums, but to private European labs where they were studied in secret. What they found was staggering. Some papyri detailed plant-based compounds for treating inflammation, circulatory disease, and even neurological disorders using herbs we still recognize today. Yet, instead of releasing this information, pharmaceutical firms synthesized chemical equivalents and patented them as modern drugs. Billions of dollars were made while the originals were quietly lost. Egyptian officials were bribed to turn a blind eye. When independent scholars requested access to the full corpus of ancient Egyptian medical texts, they were told most had been damaged during excavation. But internal correspondence between archaeologists tells another story. Select materials transferred to private preservation as per sponsor request. In other words, the cures were too good, too effective to release publicly. Because in a system where illness fuels profit, health is bad business. Modern science continues to confirm the brilliance of these ancient physicians. In 2020, researchers from the University of Manchester found that residue on ancient bandages contained honey mold and copper compounds, all naturally antibiotic. Egypt didn't just invent medicine, it might have perfected it. And then modern greed buried it. If ancient doctors were already curing disease, it raises a bigger question. What else did early civilizations know that we've forgotten or had taken from us? Well, in the 1930s, archaeologists in Mesopotamia stumbled upon clay tablets that could have rewritten the history of math, astronomy, and engineering. They didn't just vanish, they were bought, hidden, and classified. Let's talk about the Sumerian secret seizure. The Sumerian secret seizure. In the 1930s, while the world was distracted by looming war and the Great Depression, a quieter revolution was happening under the sands of Mesopotamia. Archaeologists unearthed thousands of Sumerian cuneiform tablets, many dating back over 5,000 years. These weren't simple trade receipts or prayers. Some contained math, astronomy, and engineering knowledge that simply should not have existed that early in human history. At first, the academic world buzzed with excitement. One set of tablets, dubbed the Astronomical Calculation Series, appeared to chart planetary orbits with stunning accuracy right down to retrograde motion, the kind we only confirmed using telescopes millennia later. Others described geometric algorithms for land measurement and architecture that predicted principles of calculus long before Newton. But that excitement didn't last. Within a few years, the most advanced tablets had vanished from public archives, quietly purchased or classified under the guise of national security. Some ended up in private European collections. Others were traced to government facilities in the US and Britain, where scholars were denied access for decades. Why? Because their contents threatened the core narrative of human progress. If a Bronze Age civilization could calculate planetary motion, what else had we underestimated about our ancestors? According to the late Assyriologist Dr. Samuel Kramer, certain tablets were selectively removed before publication because they contained unverified technical content. That's academic code for too advanced to explain. Even more intriguing are whispers that early aerospace engineers studied some of these designs, reverse engineering their principles for propulsion and material science. It sounds like science fiction, but patents filed in the 1950s for advanced alloys and gyroscopic systems bear eerie similarities to Sumerian mechanical diagrams. Officially, governments justified the secrecy as cultural preservation. Unofficially, it looks a lot like technological containment knowledge locked away until it could be monetized or militarized. The same pattern we've seen before: hide it, exploit it, rewrite history. To this day, thousands of Sumerian tablets remain missing. Museums display fragments about myths and gods, but the mathematical, astronomical, and engineering texts still under translation. 5,000 years later, we're still being told, you're not ready for this knowledge. And if you think the 1930s were the end of the story, think again. Because when World War II erupted, the race for ancient power went global. Both the Nazis and the Allies began hunting for alchemy, convinced that medieval science might unlock weapons of the future. Next up, the Alchemy archive theft, where centuries-old manuscripts promised nuclear secrets, and modern governments decided to believe them. The Alchemy archive theft. When you think of alchemy, you probably picture robed mystics trying to turn lead into gold. But during World War II, both Nazi Germany and the Allied powers saw alchemy as something far more serious and far more dangerous. Because buried beneath centuries of superstition were fragments of real chemical and metallurgical science, and whoever found them first could change the balance of power forever. As Allied troops advanced through Europe, special research divisions were assigned a strange mission not to capture weapons, but manuscripts. Entire libraries, monasteries, and archives were stripped clean of medieval alchemical texts. These were works by figures like Albertus Magnus, Basil Valentine, and Roger Bacon, men who had been dismissed as mystics, but who might have left behind something more: formulas for creating energy alloys and chemical reactions that modern chemistry couldn't yet replicate. Among the stolen works was the legendary Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, an artifact so old its origins blur between mythology and science. Encoded within it were instructions for manipulating matter at the atomic level long before anyone even knew atoms existed. Sounds unbelievable, right? But Allied scientists reportedly took it seriously enough to forward the material to early nuclear research labs. In a strange twist, those same labs later produced the atomic bomb. By 1946, the Nazi Ahnenerbe archives, the SS research wing dedicated to ancient science, were seized by the US and Britain. Instead of declassifying what they found, the documents were sealed and funneled into classified programs under military supervision. Why? Because among the cryptic medieval diagrams were descriptions of chemical reactions that appeared to defy thermodynamics reactions that generated energy without traditional combustion. In modern terms, they resembled primitive theories of cold fusion. Even if 90% of it was pseudoscience, the remaining 10% was enough to terrify physicists and fascinate intelligence agencies. The public was told alchemy was fantasy, a dead relic of superstition. But in laboratories from Los Alamos to London, scientists quietly tested those same manuscripts for decades. And while none admitted success, the surge in post-war breakthroughs in synthetic materials, high-energy fuels, and superconductive alloys feels eerily timed. By the 1960s, academic access to medieval chemistry texts became almost impossible. Universities received censored microfilm copies missing the detailed formula pages. Independent historians who tried to investigate were dismissed as cranks. Yet patents for new metal composites started emerging, eerily echoing alchemical recipes. The line between myth and science blurred, and maybe that's the point. Alchemy was never really about magic. It was about transformation energy and the hidden structure of matter. Ideas that in the right hands could rewrite the laws of physics, or weaponize them. And while the Western powers buried Europe's alchemical legacy, another empire on the other side of the world was conducting its own knowledge raid. This time not for weapons or medicine, but for the oldest science of all, how humans read the earth and stars. Because between 1950 and 1980, Australia's government quietly stripped its First Peoples of their most valuable inheritance, the Aboriginal Dreamtime maps. The Aboriginal Dreamtime raid. Between 1950 and 1980, teams of Australian government anthropologists travelled deep into the outback, supposedly to study Aboriginal culture. But their real mission, as later revealed through leaked departmental memos, was something far more calculated to extract scientific knowledge hidden within Indigenous oral traditions. Knowledge that had quietly guided human survival on that continent for over 50,000 years. The Aboriginal peoples didn't just know the land, they read it. Their Dreamtime stories weren't myths in the modern sense, but encoded maps describing underground aquifers, mineral seams, and fault lines with uncanny precision. When mining companies got access to these oral records, they struck resources with almost no geological surveying. Coincidence? Hardly. Many of those same anthropologists went on to work for energy conglomerates within a decade. And that's not all. Aboriginal elders were also master astronomers. Their constellations didn't just name stars, they tracked seasonal changes, animal migrations, and weather patterns. Modern astronomers have since confirmed that some of these sky stories accurately depict phenomena like the Milky Way's dark dust lanes and variable stars invisible to casual observation. In other words, they were doing data science through storytelling. Then there was the navigation system, a mental GPS built from songs known as songlines. By singing their routes, Aboriginal travellers could cross thousands of kilometres of desert, aligning with celestial markers and geological landmarks. When researchers from the University of New South Wales studied this in the 2000s, they found its accuracy rivaled early Western cartography without a single compass or written map. Yet in the mid-20th century, Australian military intelligence classified portions of these song archives, citing potential navigational applications. Medical knowledge was taken too. Aboriginal healers or Ngangkari practiced herbal medicine that Western pharmacology would later rediscover, from antibacterial plants to natural pain relievers derived from eucalyptus and native mint. Pharmaceutical companies quietly patented similar compounds decades later, often without acknowledgement of their source traditions. The saddest part: when Aboriginal communities asked for their knowledge back, they were told it was too sensitive for repatriation. Meanwhile, portions of it were being used in weather modelling, geological prospecting, and environmental engineering, stripped of credit to the cultures that sustained it. Anthropologist Dr. Bill Gamage once wrote, "The land was not wild, it was designed." He meant that Aboriginal people managed ecosystems through fire pattern and knowledge, and environmental intelligence so advanced modern ecology is only beginning to grasp it. So what happens when a civilization treats that kind of knowledge as disposable or worse, exploitable? We lose not just science but perspective. Because the universe doesn't hide its secrets. We just keep burying the people who already found them. And that brings us to our final act, the Greek manuscript heist, and a conclusion that ties all 10 mysteries together. Because when you follow the pattern from ancient Greece to modern corporations, one truth becomes clear: knowledge is power, and power rarely shares. The Greek manuscript heist. By the time World War II broke out, every major power understood one thing: whoever controlled knowledge would control the future. So, while soldiers fought over land, secret units fought over libraries. In occupied Greece, Nazi forces began systematically raiding monasteries and universities, targeting manuscripts written by the likes of Archimedes, Pythagoras, and Hero of Byzantium, not for their historical value, but for their engineering secrets. These weren't dusty philosophy scrolls they contained: blueprints, mechanical gears, optical systems, early flight concepts, and even acoustic designs that modern physicists still marvel at today. Among the most famous was the Archimedes palimpsest, a manuscript containing lost treatises on infinity buoyancy and mechanical leverage. Portions of it did survive, but reports from post-war scholars mention additional pages seen in German possession pages that vanished after Allied recovery operations. Where did they go? Into Allied research facilities, allegedly under the Office of Naval Intelligence. It sounds unbelievable, but think about it. The Allies had just learned that Nazi scientists had used ancient mathematical ratios to improve radar design and torpedo guidance. After the war, those same scientists and their archives were absorbed into Operation Paperclip, the classified US program that recruited Nazi experts. The captured manuscripts went with them. From there, the line between ancient science and modern defense research blurred into oblivion. Historians later uncovered that several Greek metallurgical scrolls were translated and distributed among British and American chemical labs in 1946. One fragment described a heat-resistant compound using powdered silica and volcanic ash, eerily similar to what NASA would later use in its space shuttle tiles. Officially, it's coincidence. But how many coincidences start in burned-out monasteries? Greek authorities repeatedly demanded the return of their manuscripts, but Western governments claimed they'd been destroyed in the chaos of war. Yet internal memos from 1951 refer to materials under restricted study pending classification clearance. Translation: the knowledge wasn't lost, just locked away. And that's the thread running through every one of these stories, from the Vatican's stolen cosmologies to the Mayan star charts and Tibetan consciousness scrolls. When powerful institutions discover knowledge that can reshape the world, they don't burn it. They hide it. Because in every era, one truth repeats: science isn't always suppressed because it's false. Sometimes it's suppressed because it's true and inconvenient. Across thousands of years and continents, a single pattern emerges: knowledge discovered, knowledge feared, knowledge stolen. The Vatican heist hid our place in the cosmos. The Alexandria Extraction silenced ancient engineers. The Mayan codices could have revolutionized astronomy. The Tibetan raid held the keys to consciousness. The native Egyptian and Aboriginal extractions rewrote science without crediting their creators. And the Greek and Sumerian seizures proved that even our oldest ancestors may have known more than we do now. Maybe human progress hasn't been a straight line forward. Maybe it's been a spiral, rediscovering truths we already had, then lost to greed, control, or fear. But here's the hopeful twist: knowledge has a way of resurfacing. Every rediscovered tablet, every decoded manuscript, every ancient experiment confirmed by modern physics. It all whispers the same message. Truth doesn't disappear, it waits. So maybe the real question isn't who stole our knowledge, but when will we be brave enough to reclaim it? Which of these mysteries do you think changed history the most, or still shapes it today? Let me know in the comments. And if you love exploring how hidden science, lost civilizations, and forbidden knowledge all intertwine, subscribe. Because the next great discovery might not come from a lab, but from something humanity once knew and forgot.